Hello, I'm your host, Brian Callanan. What does the future of Seattle's economy look like as we emerge from COVID? And where is the city spending its relief funding? What's the status of the regional approach to homelessness, with new challenges inside and outside Seattle city limits? Plus, what happens June 30th, when Seattle's eviction moratorium is set to expire? Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda and Council President Lorena González answer these questions and the ones you're sending in too, next on Council Edition.
There's no question that tenants are at a greater disadvantage in this equation than landlords.
What we have to do is open up more shelters, more hotels, more tiny house villages, and what I'd like to see is a safe lot for those RVs as well.
All that and more coming up next on City Inside Out, Council Edition. And here they are. We are joined by Council President Lorena González from Citywide Position 9 and Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda from Citywide Position 8. The two moms are here and they are ready to go. So let's take it off here. Councilmember Mosqueda, I will start with you. You had the Finance Committee and you heard some good news about our city budget just a few days before we recorded the show. Tax revenue is looking up for this year, about $20 million more than previously expected. But and you can't spell budget without but, it appears it'll take our city at least 2 years to get back to pre-pandemic levels on employment, and some of our industries are still lagging a little bit here. What did you hear in that report from the budget director?
Well, thank you so much, Brian. I think that what you said is appropriate. There has to be a but. I want folks to know that this is cautiously optimistic report that we heard this week from the budget and finance folks. They're giving us an outlook that shows, unlike what we heard a year ago, where all of us thought that revenues were going to be on the decline, we're slowly starting to see an increase. It's like a check mark recovery. We declined rapidly and we're slowly building back. So it's good news, but I would say that we have to be very cautious. There's a lot of uncertainty out there still. And what's important is that we continue to work to make sure that folks have the dollars for economic recovery. That's why we're working on the American Rescue Plan Act right now. It will allocate $119 million in the first tranche of funds to help small businesses, cash assistance for workers, childcare support. This is how our economy will continue to recover and make sure that it's not a wave of a recovery, but a true progression in terms of stability for working families, our smallest businesses, and our most vulnerable. So cautiously optimistic, but a lot more work to come. And we're going to be deploying those federal resources very soon to help working families across Seattle.
Yeah, and Council President González, I wanted to talk to you about this because you, Councilmember Mosqueda, Mayor Durkin announced this new $18 million COVID relief package soon after this budget announcement. This is an extension, as I understand it, of 2020 relief funds that were not spent last year, and we still have that $119 million that Councilmember Mosqueda was talking about with the American Rescue Act. Tell us about this $18 million relief package. Is it the right time to be spending this extra money when we talk about this uneven growth in our economy? What do we have here?
It's absolutely the right time to infuse within our community a additional set of COVID relief. So these are dollars that are going to directly support people's public health, food access, additional vaccination, infrastructure development, and some additional dollars related to childcare stabilization. So these are really important investments and all key strategies to making sure that our families continue to be healthy and continue to be housed and continue to be fed so that we can make it through the rest of the year. So this was a pleasant surprise to have an additional surplus $18 million, and we are thrilled to be able to get it out into community as quickly as possible to meet the greatest need in our communities.
Yep, and I know a lot of discussion will be going on over the next several months when it comes to our COVID response here, especially financially. Councilmember Mosqueda, back to you with another finance question here, if I could. The council recently made a change to the Jumpstart payroll tax on higher salaries at large companies. It went into effect this year. This had to do with people employed inside the city or outside the city. You had some questions coming in for businesses about this. You're giving those businesses some different options right now. I wanted to talk about this. What did you change? And this is a big question here for me. Is this going to reduce the amount of tax revenue that the city can get from Jumpstart? What happens next year?
Well, thank you, Brian. I think what's really important about the process that we went through is to show the legislative process is never done. Good legislators listen to how implementation is going, how rulemaking is going, and we make small changes to make sure that it's more implementable, that it's more workable for the folks that it's going to affect. What we heard during the rulemaking process from the Finance and Administrative Services Department during the rulemaking was that there were a handful of businesses who said, you know, it'd be a lot easier for me to calculate on a per hour ratio instead of just a majority of time for my employees if they're spending time in the city of Seattle. And they wanted that option. The entire bill that we passed last year has not changed. We've just added another option, like you said. So employers can make a decision if their employees are predominantly assigned in Seattle and they want to go ahead and pay the allocation as originally written into our statute. They can go ahead and do that and not worry about the hourly calculation. We heard during the process of writing the bill, that was actually a lot easier for many of the large employers that we were talking to. But during rulemaking, we heard from some some of the employers at the table that actually they prefer for a smaller amount of hours and to actually look at the per hour ratio. That's the right thing to do to give them that option. What we heard specifically during the committee meeting from Finance and Administrative Services and our central staff was that there was no major change in the type of calculation, the assumptions that went into the calculation to skew how much we can expect to come in. I want to talk about the magnitude of these dollars. Okay. Over $200 million a year over the next 20 years is like receiving ARPA funds for COVID every year for the next 20 years. It's significant. And that statistic, that note was brought to me by one of our friends in the business world who said, people need to really understand the magnitude, the importance of Jumpstart. And so I'm really excited about being able to offer employers a choice and know that we'll still bring in over $200 million.
I look at that though, Councilmember Mosqueda, and I'm just concerned that if there is a choice for businesses, they will choose the option that'll cost them less money, and that might affect the bottom line. Do you have any thoughts about that piece of it?
Well, when we were talking to Finance and Administrative Services, they said, think about it this way. If you have about 50 employees who are in Seattle predominantly most of the time, and you're paying 100% of their salary, those might be the 50 employees that you're paying on $200,000 of their salary. But if you have 150 employees and you're doing a per hourly calculation, they might have a smaller amount overall, a slightly smaller amount, but you're actually paying on a larger universe of employees. So the change in what is expected is going to be negligible, at least from our understanding. And a lot of assumptions are built into this. So we'll see very soon in about 8 months when that first check gets cut.
Okay, thanks very much for this. Council President González, I know this is a measure that a lot of businesses had some questions about. There's a lawsuit pending against Jumpstart that's set to start soon, but I thought it was interesting to see in the Seattle Times recently, the new head of the Metro Chamber said she basically wanted to call a truce with council members and other local leaders here. I'm looking at this change to Jumpstart, and I'm trying to figure out how this fits in with the idea of building a better relationship with the business community. What do you think about that?
I think it's important to recognize that in Jumpstart, within the Jumpstart payroll tax proposal, there are a significant number of dollars that we are included in the spending plan specifically to support small businesses and our economic system throughout the city, again, on the out years. And so I think, for us, we have a long history in the city council of holding harmless those businesses who cannot afford to comply with many of the new labor standards and the new regulations that we are passing. Now, larger corporations, the story is different there. I believe larger corporations do continue to have an obligation and a responsibility to be good neighbors and to be good partners to the city of Seattle, and they can afford it. We have many, many, many very affluent tech corporations in our city who in fact are doing exceptionally well, even in some cases because of this COVID pandemic. I think it's only right to ask them to pay into the system to help us build a better economy and to help us build a better, more vibrant city as we look to coming out of COVID. And I think Jumpstart does that. And we will always be available, ready, and willing to have conversation with those who are impacted by our regulations. That doesn't mean that we're going to agree on the policy outcome, but it does mean that we value their input because it does influence how we develop and shape our policy. The amendment we just made on Jumpstart Seattle is an example of just that.
I really want to underscore the last point that the council president just made, because I do think that it's important for us to push back, I think, on a false narrative that somehow city council or the city as a whole is not friendly to business. In fact, what we did immediately when COVID hit Seattle was we released millions of dollars for small business assistance. We made sure that there was support for childcare for those small businesses as well to pay rent. This is what it looks like to make sure in the moment of crisis, we're standing up and making sure that our business community has support that they need. And by doing so, also making sure that workers have the support they need. But before that, we always had a door open policy. And I know the council president and I have constantly asked people for feedback and wanting to make sure that legislation is drafted to incorporate feedback or concerns that we hear. There were very large corporations, along with small businesses, business associations like GSBA, who helped shape that bill to begin with. So I do want to push back on a false narrative that somehow it is not business friendly to have dollars that get invested right back into our local infrastructure, into our local economy, and help create more successful businesses in the future. I think it's going to be a real win-win. And if folks take a look at that funding, 2/3 of it go to housing and homelessness. We cannot reopen our businesses if folks are living in the doorsteps of our smallest businesses. That's important dollars for small businesses that we get folks housed. And the rest of it, economic resilience, equitable development initiatives, things that actually spur economic activity and create a healthier local economy.
Thank you for bringing that up. And maybe Councilmember Mosqueda, I can stay with you here because I've received a number of different emails with regards to our homelessness crisis. Many of them have centered on Miller Park, right next to Meany Middle School on Capitol Hill. Shortly before we recorded the show, as you know, the city cleared out an unauthorized encampment there. There were concerns from families that sound a lot like this. One person writes, "Why can't we separate people who often have addiction or mental health issues from places where kids should be safe?" Another says, "What is your plan to return our parks to be used by families, children, and citizens?" The city has not done a lot of sweeps. The CDC has advised against that if there's not proper shelter available during COVID, but this has turned into a big citywide issue. How do you respond to those concerns?
City Council has scaled up the funding available to tiny houses and hotels. We've also scaled up the funding to the HOPE program and other community organizations that are helping to do exactly what your caller just noted. Identify folks who need mental health services, identify folks who need behavioral health services, get folks inside and help make sure that people get stabilized. The most important thing that we can do to help remove folks who are sleeping in parks and along our streets and RVs is to offer them appropriate shelter as an interim measure until we get them into housing. Again, the most important thing we can do for folks is make sure that they have housing on the horizon. Our shelters were at capacity before COVID. Our current non-congregate shelters are at capacity right now. What we have to do is open up more shelters, more hotels, more tiny house villages. And what I'd like to see is a safe lot for those RVs as well as an interim measure as we open up more permanent supportive housing that, well, as your caller mentioned, couple housing with mental health and behavioral health services. And that's how we truly separate out who needs which services by getting them into the housing they need.
Got it. Lorena, I just wanted to make sure you responded to another viewer here that I think speaks to your role on the Regional Homelessness Authority. Eric wrote this: "Mayor Durkin has been saying that 60% of the homeless in Seattle were homeless when they got here and that Seattle can't house everyone. Do you agree? And if so, what can be done to force places like Mercer Island to begin helping out instead of just pushing the problem to Seattle?" Thank you for the email there. A number of cities in King County, as you know, are passing laws that are not all that friendly to homeless people, if I may, really hurting this idea of a regional effort, which is just starting to get off the ground with the new CEO after several delays. Your thought about that figure the mayor's talking about, that 60% of the homeless in Seattle were homeless when they got here, and this idea towards the regional homelessness response and its impacts right now?
Well, I think that number tells us how important it is for us to stay committed to a regional approach as it relates to addressing the experience of people experiencing homelessness. We know that homelessness has no boundaries. That's why it's really important for us to stay committed to a regional effort. I'm going to continue to discourage our neighboring cities and towns from passing laws that are not harm reduction approaches and that do nothing more than if not in reality, in perception, criminalize people for being poor and unhoused. That is a strategy that is not going to work. It is not evidence-based. It is not data-driven, and it is inhumane. So I think it's important for us to stay committed to the Regional Homelessness Authority. I think now that we have a CEO on board, Mark Dones, I think CEO Dones is going to play an important role of bringing us all back together and making sure that our sub-regional plans are reflective of those strategies that actually work to get folks housed in a harm reduction, evidence based way. And I think that's going to be critical for us now and as we continue to come out of COVID and into the future.
Yeah. Lorena, let me stick with you here because this concept of how we respond to homelessness really getting put to the test with the recently proposed charter amendment from Compassion Seattle. This measure is still in signature gathering mode, but it would require the city to add housing units, more mental health and substance use disorder treatment, and ensure that public spaces are kept clear without adding any new taxes. If this measure made the ballot passed, how would that affect the efforts towards a regional homelessness response and how we pay for it?
You know, I think again, I want us to stay committed to a regional approach to solving for homelessness. That 60% number that you identified that the mayor has reported on is you know one of the many facts why it's important for us to stay committed to a regional approach. The second thing that I would say is that all of the concepts in the proposed charter amendment related to getting more people housed, to having one for one, in other words, each person you reach out to should have a place to go to, increase in mental health and behavioral health services. All of those things are things that we all support and know work. And we want to do more of it. And in fact, we have been doing more of it. I think that, to the extent that we continue to support those harm reduction strategies, those are good things. The reality is, and the truth needs to be told to folks, that none of us want to see people using parks, streets, green spaces, or any other place that is not inside of a four walls that is warm as housing. Nobody wants that. We don't want that. The proponents of this don't want that. The opponents of the charter amendment don't want this. So the question is how do we come together to unlock the political gridlock on this and be willing to work with each other, with our state partners, with our federal partners on making sure that we are identifying how to implement the millions of dollars that the region and the city continue to invest in this space to help people compassionately and effectively move from outside to inside. I'm going to stay committed to that mission critical purpose, and I invite everyone else to also join us in that effort and to continue to work with us to identify progressive revenue sources to support this work like we did with Jumpstart Seattle.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Councilmember Mosqueda, if I could, I wanted to move along to a different issue here, talking about the expiration of Seattle's eviction moratorium coming up on June 30th. A few messages for you to respond to on this topic too. One person writes, how long do you expect landlords to continue to provide housing under the eviction ban with no rent coming in? Another says, Seattle and all of Washington must extend the eviction moratorium. Residential tenants aren't the only ones who need it. Small businesses and nonprofits do too. So I know the city is starting to look at some rental regulations. And my question is, what does the Seattle City Council need to do for renters and for landlords as we start to transition out of COVID mode here?
Thanks again, Brian. I think that nobody expects small landlords to go without having some sort of compensation. And that's exactly why in the first funding round that we provided last year in the spring of 2020, it included rental assistance. That's why we included rental assistance in our fall budget. And that's why just 2 weeks ago, we provided another $23 million in rental assistance that came in the form of federal support from Congress. This is really important for folks to know. While eviction moratoriums are in place, which are the right thing to do, as so many people have lost jobs, they have lost their livelihoods, perhaps they've lost their small business in this time of COVID. If they are not able to pay rent, what is important for us to do is to make sure that they have a subsidy in hand that goes directly to that landlord. The $23 million is funding that goes to places like United Way, community organizations, the Office of Housing that pay landlords, small landlords, in order for their tenants to stay in place. Now, in the long term, we're going to need to continue to make sure that folks have the economic stability that they need to be able to stay housed. The last thing that we need as we come out of COVID is for more people to lose their homes, just as they're finally able to get a job. So I think the continuing rolling extensions of the evictions is the right thing to do. I also think that it's important to recognize the rental assistance dollars have been assistance for small landlords as well.
Okay.
You know, you look at other countries, it would be great if our country would have done with what other countries have done with similar economies and provided wage replacement. Somewhere between 60 to 90% is what I saw in other countries. In lieu of that, things like rental assistance is a way to help make the economy continue to run and to make sure that renters have the stability they need, along with the small landlords who rely on those rental payments.
To be clear, do you support extending the eviction moratorium further for the city?
Yeah, I think that we've continued to see more and more people slowly be able to get vaccinated, not at the rate that we had wanted to originally. But Washington State, Seattle, King County, we're leading the nation in many ways. Our vaccination clinic is the largest and most successful at the national level. We have a lot to be proud of. But this country continues to lag behind in where we need to be to hit herd immunity. So people are not going to be able to come back out, open their small business shop, get a job. And until we have economic stability for folks, we need to continue to have both rental assistance and I believe a continuation of the eviction moratorium.
Thank you for touching on those issues. Council President González, I'd like you to weigh in too, if I could. A few more messages from our viewers concerned about the future of our rental housing market. One writes, housing regulation is depleting the supply of rental housing. What will happen when these houses sell out of the rental market and Section 8 families have nowhere to go? So some concerns about losing some apartment stock there, and this as well. Small landlords continue to be ignored in the legislative process at City Hall. Why are local mom and pops not included in the process here? Your thoughts about this, small landlords clearly speaking up about this, and the eviction moratorium that's ending June 30th. Some thoughts here, please.
Yeah, I am not aware of any actual studies or statistics that support the theory that increased tenant regulations depletes apartment or rental inventory in our city. So I want to start with that. And so I don't think that is actually happening in our city. I think that our city's rental market is largely dictated by the number of people who need access to rental units. And in our city, that's over 50% of our population rents rather than owns property. And so long as that continues to be the case, there will be a market influence reason to continue to provide rentals to the people who want to live in this city. The second thing I would say is that you know, I think that it's really important for us to continue to do rental assistance, as Councilmember Mosqueda just said. I do think it's important for us to have the eviction moratoriums. I also think it's important for us to identify available dollars to be able to provide supports to landlords who are equally obligated to make financial payments to continue to maintain that rental housing. We aren't pursuing eviction moratoriums to be punitive towards landlords. We are pursuing eviction moratoriums coupled with rental assistance and mortgage assistance as a key way to prevent additional people entering into homelessness or housing instability, and in an effort to stabilize our rental market to prevent a huge number of vacancies, which would, I believe, just contribute to the downturn of our economy. I don't think landlords want that. We certainly don't want that, and tenants don't want that. So I think we just need to continue to stay dedicated to identifying dollars and programs at the state and the federal and the city level that are going to help both. But there's no question that tenants are at a greater disadvantage in this equation than landlords who are property owners. I'm not saying that they are, you know, real estate moguls, but there is an inequity in terms of positional power and wealth.
Okay. All right. Thank you for bringing up those pieces. Councilmember Mosqueda, you brought up some of the different figures around COVID and what's happening in our city, and a recent milestone there. Seattle passed the 100,000 mark in terms of COVID shots at our city's 4 vaccination sites. I wanted to talk about this because we're seeing across the country, and in Seattle too, some areas where there are still some people who might be hesitant about getting the vaccine. Councilmember Herbold told me a few weeks ago, part of her district in West Seattle has some of the lowest vaccination rates in King County. How do you change that trend?
Well, first of all, Brian, I want to say I cannot miss an opportunity to talk about the need to remove the rental ban, the rental unit ban related to that last question. If folks are concerned about there not being enough rental housing stock, I know what we're considering and what we're committed to is getting rid of the exclusionary zoning policies in this city that prevent more affordable rental units from being built, more rental units to begin with. Apartment ban across the city is untenable. It is allowing for 75% of this land to continue to just be allocated for single family housing. We need multifamily structures, and that equals more rental units for those 52% of the population that rent and need to continue to have a place to live. So
thanks for touching on that. Yeah.
On the COVID aspect, look, I think that part of this responsibility relies on us as public servants, making sure that we are getting resources out to people who have the ability to do outreach in language in bicultural, bilingual ways to make sure that folks know about the availability of vaccines and to answer any questions. I don't believe vaccine hesitancy is just because people are concerned about the recent paper that they read on some, quack website. It is because people are concerned about the historical nature of people of color being disproportionately harmed by past public health efforts. We have to overcome and we have to acknowledge that this true trauma that is historical in nature for many of our communities of color needs to be addressed, not because people are unaware of vaccines, but because they have been harmed in the past. And so making sure that more community health clinics, more federally qualified health centers have access to vaccines, that we're providing folks with the tools and services so navigators or promotoras can go out and have conversations, especially in the South End. That's critical. The other thing is folks have to remember we have still a responsibility to wear our masks, to socially distance, and to make sure that we are not creating additional harm right now. We do not have enough herd immunity out there. So if you have been vaccinated, please continue to follow these public health precautions and to recognize that we are a long ways away from true safety and herd immunity. And it's going to require all of us acting together.
Council President González, did you want to say something about this? I know you're always trying to reach out to those different communities in the immigrant community for sure.
Yeah, just today I got my first COVID vaccine. I went to the International Community Health Services in Holly Park, and I was just really impressed with the operation, and I was also really heartened and hopeful by the fact that every single person that I saw there was somebody from a BIPOC community, somebody from an immigrant and refugee community in particular. So I think that is a testament to sort of debunking this narrative that communities of color and the immigrants and refugees are vaccine hesitant. We're not vaccine hesitant. We just want to be treated in a way that is culturally and linguistically acceptable for our communities and for our elders. And when we invest in public health models and in community health clinics that do just that, we will see those vaccination rates increase. But that's what it's going to take to break through on this. We need to utilize the infrastructure of our community health clinics who have trusting, meaningful relationships with immigrants and refugees in our community who are lagging behind in getting the vaccine. But it's not because they don't want it. It's not because they don't care. It's not because they're ignorant. It's because we have neglected to recognize what culturally responsive medical treatment actually looks like.
Okay, thank you both for this. And I know you both have your second Mother's Day coming up. Happy Mother's Day to you both. It's coming up on May 9th.
Thanks.
Thank you, Brian.
Fair enough. All right, everyone else, call your mom at home. That's May 9th here. We'll see you next time on Council Edition.